Greetings, listeners. This summer, I watched the World Cup along with everybody else, but I didn't grow up on soccer, so half of it went right past me. Someone got a red card, and I had no idea why that was such a big deal. The goalkeeper picked up the ball with his hands, and I thought, wait, isn't that against the rules for everybody? Well, the folks I was watching with, they were completely locked in. I'm sitting there trying to figure out what I was watching, trying to make sense out of it all. So I'm watching the same story as everybody else, but it's clear I just don't know the rules yet. And that's what it feels like to open the Bible without knowing about the first 5 books. Well, welcome everyone. I'm your host, Jackie Adewale, and this is the Bible Basics Podcast, where every 2 weeks we break down the basics of the Bible into understandable, bite-sized chunks. Now, remember that feeling I just mentioned, watching a game and not knowing why a red card mattered or why the goalkeeper got to use his hands. That's what it's like to open the Bible without this part we're going to discuss today. We're going to turn to something a little different. If you've been tuned in, you know that we've been spending time learning how to read the Bible. Now we're turning to what's actually inside it. We're looking at the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And there's a name for these 5 books altogether. It's called the Pentateuch. That word means 5 scrolls in Greek. The Hebrew term for these books is Torah. Now, most of the books in the Bible read like a story. Some parts read like a list of instructions about how to live. And these 5 books we're focusing on today have both. And this is where the story starts. We're going to spend some real time here because everything that comes later in the Bible stands on what happens in these first 5 books. And once you know this part, the rest of the Bible starts making a lot more sense. Let's get into it. So, who were these 5 books written for? Well, picture a people who had just walked out of slavery in Egypt. They didn't have a home yet. They were somewhere in between, headed for a land God had promised them. They just watched God part the Red Sea to rescue them. And not long after, they ran out of water in the desert, and they asked out loud, "Is the Lord even with us or not?" Much of what we're about to look at speaks to a new generation, one that's standing right at the edge of the promised land, about to cross in, though without Moses, who had led them their whole lives. Think of the Pentateuch as a foundational instruction manual that Moses left behind for God's people. The Pentateuch was designed to show Israel where it had come from and where it was headed, answering the questions a new nation would ask as they prepared to enter the promised land. Who is God? What does it mean to be God's people? And what does it look like to walk with Him instead of just survive? These 5 books wrestle with these questions and more. Now let's look at what that actually looks like. Let's start with the first of the 5, Genesis. This is a book about beginnings. God creates the world. People rebel and disobey Him, and everything breaks because of it. That's the beginning of sin entering the world. But God doesn't walk away. He begins working through one man, Abraham, and the family that comes from him to bring blessings to the whole world. That promise made to Abraham is written out in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Now, the next book is Exodus. Abraham's family now has grown into a whole nation, enslaved in Egypt. God rescues them and brings them to Himself at Mount Sinai, where He gives them a way to live as a free people. The third book is Leviticus. God is holy, but he's chosen to live with his people who are definitely not holy. He's chosen to live among his people anyway. This book provides a system to make continued fellowship between God and his people, Israel, possible despite their sinfulness. It contains detailed instructions on how Israel should worship God and live well with each other. The fourth in the Pentateuch is the book of Numbers. Numbers is a story of rebellion and disobedience, but it's also the story of grace and mercy. Israel starts the journey to the promised land, but fear and rebellion keep getting in the way. One generation refuses to trust God. God stays faithful anyway. And the last book is Deuteronomy. Before the next generation crosses into the land, Moses gives them one last talk. He retells their history, renews their promise to God, teaches God's instructions again, and calls them to love and trust him with everything. That's the 5 books, one connected story. And at the center of it, God tells Israel, through Moses, the man he raised up to lead them out of Egypt, exactly why he rescued them. Listen to Exodus chapter 19, verses 3 through 6. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." Hold on to that thought. We'll come back to it in a second. Here's the meaning running underneath all 5 books. God created human beings to live with him and reflect his character, but people rebelled and sin broke everything: the relationship with God, with each other, with the world itself. God didn't abandon what he set out to do. He called Abraham and promised to build a family through him, and through that family to bring blessings to every nation on earth. When that family grew into a nation and became enslaved in Egypt, God rescued them, but he did more than set them free. Remember that passage you just heard, where God tells Moses what Israel is being rescued for. He wasn't just getting them out of Egypt. He was bringing them to himself. He was forming them into a people who would belong to him, live in his presence, and show the other nations what he was like. That helps us understand the laws in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These laws showed Israel what life with a holy God was meant to look like in worship, and how they treated each other, especially the poor and the outsider. But Israel struggled to trust and obey. Again and again, the people failed. Again and again, God stayed faithful to what he'd promised. By the time Deuteronomy ends, the story isn't finished. Israel is standing outside the promised land. Moses is about to die. And the deeper problem, the one inside every human heart, sin, hasn't gone away. These 5 books begin the Bible story. They also leave us waiting to see what God does next. That's a single arc. It's not 5 separate stories bolted together, which means if you only read Genesis or only read Exodus, you're reading one chapter of something bigger. You're not getting the whole story. So let's talk about its significance back then. For Israel, these 5 books answered some of the most basic questions people could ask. Who are we? Whose are we? What has God done for us? And how should we live now? Take one example. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, Moses tells parents what to do when their children ask about all of this. When your child asks, why do we live this way? You tell them the story. They were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out. This is why the story got passed down on purpose, parents to children, generation after generation. So no one forgot who had rescued them or why. And it connects back to that promise, all the way back in Genesis, that Abraham's family would bring blessings to every nation. Israel's whole way of life was meant to show the world what that looked like. These 5 books gave Israel an identity, a calling, and a story they were never supposed to forget. They're the record of a people's learning, sometimes the hard way, what it means to walk with God instead of just knowing about Him. So now let's talk about why it still matters to us today. Think back to that World Cup story I was telling you. Once you know a red card matters and why the goalkeeper gets to use his hands, you watch the whole game differently. Nothing about the game changed. You did. That's what these 5 books do for the rest of the Bible. You don't have to memorize them. You don't have to have them all figured out today. But when you get to the prophets later on in the Bible, and someone's reminding Israel about a promise or a warning, you'll recognize where that's coming from. It's coming from here. And it isn't only the prophets. When the New Testament talks about Adam, Abraham, Moses, Passover, sacrifice, priests, promises, or the wilderness, it's drawing from these books. Without this background, you might recognize the words and still miss what they mean. Jesus pointed back to these same books. In Matthew 5:17, he said, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Fulfill means Jesus was what all this was pointing toward. Everything we just walked through leads to Him. Now that's your foundation, the Pentateuch. Everything else in the Bible builds on these 5 books. So you're not starting from the middle anymore. So here's something to sit with. What part of the Bible has confused you before that you think might trace back to missing this background? This week, read Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Write down what God promises Abraham, his family, and the nations. Until our next episode, keep reading, keep seeking, and keep growing in your